The morning they read the will, the sky over Harlan County was the color of an old bruise. That pale, yellowish gray that settles in after a storm has already done its worst. Ruth Calloway sat in the second-to-last row of Elwood Greer's law office, her hands folded in her lap, her coat still damp from the walk-in from the street because she hadn't been able to afford the parking garage. The office smelled of old paper and carpet cleaner and something else underneath it all, something like old money, the kind that had been sitting in the same rooms for so long it had seeped into the walls. She did not belong here. She had known that the moment she pushed open the glass door and saw the leather chairs and the oil painting of a horse above the fireplace. She had known it even more acutely when her cousin Darlene looked up from across the mahogany table, blinked once, and then looked away without speaking. That was its own kind of language. The kind that said, "What are you doing here?" and answered itself before you could respond. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Ruth was 39 years old, and she knew, the way you know things after living them long enough, that she was at the part of her life where the decisions she made now would determine which kind of story it became. She had been a cashier at the Piggly Wiggly on Route 14 for 11 years. She had a son named Marcus who was 13 and growing so fast that his shoes never fit for more than 3 months at a stretch, and a daughter named Lily who was 9 and had recently taken to carrying a small spiral notebook everywhere she went because she wanted to be a writer. Ruth had an apartment on the second floor of a building that leaked when it rained hard and had a furnace that needed coaxing every morning from October to March. She had $412 in a checking account and a credit card she was afraid to look at too directly. She had nothing that would make her look at home in Elwood Greer's office, and she had known, when the certified letter arrived telling her that her great-uncle Hollis Calloway had named her in his will, that whatever he left her would not be the kind of thing that changed a person's life. Hollis Calloway had been 81 years old. He had never married. He had lived alone for the last 30 years of his life on a property outside of town that most people in the county referred to as the Calloway place, though they said it the way you might say a punchline to a joke you had told so many times you no longer thought it was funny. The Calloway place was 400 acres of worn-out farmland, a farmhouse that had been standing since 1921 and showed every one of those years, and a barn that had collapsed on one side somewhere in the 1990s and never been repaired. Hollis had grown a little corn, kept some chickens in his later years, and mostly just lived quietly out there, the way certain old men do, as if the rest of the world had agreed to leave them alone and they had agreed to the same arrangement. Nobody in the family had visited Hollis more than twice in the last decade. That much became clear from the way people shifted in their seats and avoided each other's eyes when Elwood Greer cleared his throat and began. Ruth had visited 4 times. Not because she had expected anything in return, but because Hollis had always been kind to her when she was small, the kind of quiet kindness that didn't announce itself. A birthday card with a $20 bill tucked inside it, a jar of honey from his hives left on her mother's porch without a note, a phone call every few months that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. She had brought Marcus and Lily out to see him twice in the last 3 years. He had sat on the porch with them and told them the names of every bird that landed in the yard, and Lily had written them all down in one of her notebooks, and Hollis had looked at that child writing in her little book and smiled in a way that Ruth had not forgotten. So she had come to the reading of the will because she had been told to come, and because the certified letter had her name on it, and because $412 in a checking account had a way of making a person take seriously anything that arrived in an official envelope. She had not expected much. She had told herself she was not expecting anything at all. She had almost believed it. Elwood Greer read the bequests in order. Hollis's brother Raymond's children received the bank accounts, which turned out to be more substantial than anyone had guessed. A savings account totaling just over $90,000 was divided 3 ways among the cousins. Darlene received a set of antique silverware and a grandfather clock. Another cousin, a heavy-set man named Gary who Ruth barely knew, received the truck and 2 riding lawn mowers. A church in town received a small donation. A historical society received a box of old documents related to the Calloway family's settlement in the county, which no one else had wanted anyway. And then Elwood Greer reached Ruth's name. He read it without any particular inflection. Ruth and Calloway, formerly Ruth and Pelham, receives the entirety of the Calloway family farm property, comprising the main dwelling, all outbuildings, and all 403 acres of land as surveyed in 1987, along with any contents therein, subject to any outstanding property taxes, liens, and encumbrances. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected has happened and everyone is trying to decide how to react. Ruth did not move. She sat with her hands still folded and her coat still damp, and she read the sentence again in her mind, picking through it the way you might pick through rubble looking for something unbroken. Darlene's voice came first. Well, just that one word, drawn out thin as wire. Then Gary shifted in his chair and said something under his breath to the man sitting next to him, and the man made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Elwood Greer continued reading as if nothing had happened, but Ruth was no longer listening. She was thinking about the Calloway place. She was thinking about the leaning barn and the farmhouse with the warped front porch and the 400 acres of land that hadn't produced anything meaningful in 30 years. She was thinking about the property tax bill, which would be her responsibility now, and which she had no way of calculating yet, but which she already knew she could not pay. After the meeting adjourned, Darlene found her in the parking lot. Darlene was wearing a coat that Ruth recognized as expensive, the kind with a particular kind of lining that made it fall differently than regular coats. She looked at Ruth the way people look at someone they feel sorry for, but are also relieved not to be. "You know that place is nothing but a money pit," she said. "You know that, right? The roof on the farmhouse alone would cost $30,000, maybe $40,000 to replace. And the taxes." She shook her head. Hollis was 3 years behind on the property taxes. "Did Greer tell you that?" "He'll tell you. But I'm telling you now, so you're not surprised. You're going to get a bill that'll make your eyes water." She paused. "I know it feels like you got something, but honey." She left the last sentence unfinished, which was somehow worse than if she had finished it. Ruth drove home in her 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked rear taillight and a heater that blew cold for the first 10 minutes of every drive. She did not tell Marcus and Lily about the inheritance that night. She fed them soup she had made from a ham bone and whatever vegetables were soft enough to need using. And she listened to Marcus talk about a math test, and Lily read aloud 2 paragraphs of something she was writing about a girl who discovered a door in the side of a hill. And Ruth sat at the table and nodded and smiled, and after they were asleep, she sat at the kitchen table alone and looked up the Calloway County property tax records on her phone. The back taxes owed on the Calloway farm came to $14,632. Penalties included. There was also a lien from a roofing company for work that had been started and not completed and not paid for, which added another $4,200. $18,832. Ruth looked at that number for a long time. Then she opened her banking app and looked at the $412 and closed both apps and sat in the kitchen in the quiet. She thought about selling. The obvious answer was to sell the property, pay the taxes and the lien from the proceeds, and take whatever was left, which the online property assessors she found suggested would be somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000, depending on who you asked, though the land itself had issues she didn't fully understand yet. That was the rational answer. That was what Darlene would do. That was what Gary would do. That was what anyone with common sense and a working knowledge of their own financial situation would do. But Ruth Calloway had grown up watching rational decisions not save her mother from anything. She had watched sense and practicality and doing the right thing pile up like stones in a river that kept flooding anyway. And she had sat across from her great-uncle Hollis on that porch 4 times in 3 years, and he had watched her children with that particular quality of attention, and he had left her this thing that everyone agreed was worthless, and she did not think Hollis Calloway had been a foolish man. It took her 6 weeks to make the decision. 6 weeks of working out numbers on paper and then crumpling the paper and starting over. 6 weeks of researching agricultural grants and rural property assistance programs, and whether 400 acres of depleted farmland could be made productive again, and what that would cost, and how long it would take, and what the realistic return might look like. 6 weeks of calling her landlord and explaining that she would be leaving the apartment at the end of the month, of telling Marcus and Lily, of watching Marcus go still and quiet, and then nod in the careful way he had when he was absorbing something he didn't like, but had decided not to fight. 6 weeks of Lily saying, "So we'll be living on a real farm," with her notebook already open. She told her manager at the Piggly Wiggly on a Tuesday. She told her sister on a Wednesday. Her sister said, "Are you out of your mind?" And Ruth said, "Probably." And her sister said, "I love you, but you are making a mistake." And Ruth said, "I know you think that." And that was more or less the end of that conversation. The day she drove out to the Calloway farm with her children and a rented trailer and 3 boxes of cleaning supplies, it was still cold. February in Kentucky has a particular kind of cold, not the dramatic cold of northern winters, but something low and gray and persistent that settles into your bones without permission. The road out to the property turned to gravel about a mile from the county road, and the gravel had not been graded in some time, and the Civic bounced and shuddered over the ruts, while Lily pressed her face to the window and Marcus sat with his arms crossed in the back seat looking at his phone. Then the farm came into view, and even Ruth, who had prepared herself, felt something drop quietly in her chest. The farmhouse was worse than she remembered. The front porch sagged so severely on the left side that 2 of the support posts had separated from the roofline entirely and were being held up by what appeared to be a piece of wire cable someone had strung between them years ago as a temporary measure and then never returned to fix. The paint was gone from the south-facing walls, stripped by years of weather down to bare gray wood, and the wood itself had gone soft in places, showing the spongy dark interior rot had left behind. 3 of the upstairs windows were covered with plywood. The one that was not had a crack running diagonally from corner to corner, held together with duct tape that had turned brown and brittle. The yard was not a yard so much as a field that had agreed to stop at the house. Scrub grass and wild blackberry cane and what might have been a garden once, marked by a border of stones, now entirely overtaken by the kind of vegetation that moves in when people stop arguing with it. 2 old cars sat at the side of the house, both long stripped of anything useful, resting on bare rims, their hoods open and their interiors colonized by something Ruth could not see from the road but could imagine. The yard was not a yard so much as a field that had agreed to stop at the house. Scrub grass and wild blackberry cane and what might have been a garden once, marked by a border of stones, now entirely overtaken by the kind of vegetation that moves in when people stop arguing with it. 2 old cars sat at the side of the house, both long stripped of anything useful, resting on bare rims, their hoods open and their interiors colonized by something Ruth could not see from the road but could imagine. The children responded to it each in their own way, which told her things about them she had not quite known before. Marcus, whose silence she had often read as sullenness, was in fact a person who processed difficulty by becoming methodical. By the second day, he had made a list of everything that was broken and ranked it by urgency, without being asked. He woke early, ate without complaining about whatever she put in front of him, and found tasks to do. He split wood from the fallen section of fence row for the cast-iron stove. He helped her carry water when the pipes were still out. He repaired the hinge on the back door with the box of old hardware they found in the farmhouse kitchen and a screwdriver and 30 minutes of quiet persistence. He did not say anything positive about being there, but he did not say anything negative either. And for a 13-year-old boy who had left his school and his friends and his apartment bedroom, Ruth understood that this was its own form of love. Lily, for her part, had adopted the farm with the wholehearted commitment of a child who had been given something to write about. She filled 2 notebooks in the first week. She named the crow that sat in the dead elm at the edge of the yard and left it pieces of food and reported with satisfaction that it had begun to expect her. She found an old beehive under the porch eaves that had been abandoned for at least a season and spent an afternoon drawing it from every angle and writing a description of how bees built things and what happened to the things they built when they were gone. She discovered that the soil in the old garden plot, beneath the tangle of weeds, was darker and richer than anywhere else on the property, and she reported this to Ruth with the authority of someone who had been reading about soil composition on Ruth's phone. It was Lily, in fact, who first mentioned the floor. She had gone to the barn on the 5th day, despite Ruth's instructions to stay clear of it, because she had seen something through the gap in the collapsed wall that she wanted to investigate. She came back to the house with mud on her boots and her notebook open and said, "Mom, the floor in there, in the back part that's still standing, it looks different in one corner. Like the dirt is different." Ruth had told her to stay out of the barn and then spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about what Lily had said. And the barn. She had known about the barn, but knowing and seeing were different things. It was a large structure, or had been, built of rough-cut oak in the old way. the kind of barn that in its working years would have been the most important building on the property. One entire side had collapsed inward, the roof on that section coming down with it, the whole mass compressed into a kind of angular ruin that had been sitting there long enough to have vines growing over it, long enough that the vines had become part of the structure, holding the wreckage together in their slow-motion way. The section of the barn that was still standing looked like it was considering its options. The remaining walls leaned in two different directions, and the roof above them had a depression in the center where years of winter had packed their weight, and the wood had given incrementally. The big sliding door had come off its upper track and been propped against the outside wall, where it had been slowly becoming part of the ground for what looked like a decade. Lily, who had been quiet for the last mile of gravel road, pressed her face harder against the glass and said, "It looks like a story." Marcus said, "It looks like a disaster." Ruth said nothing. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at what Hollis Calloway had left her and tried to find in herself the thing she had been holding on to for 6 weeks, the quiet conviction that a man who watched her daughter write bird names in a notebook and smiled like that had not intended this as a punishment. She was still looking for it when she got out of the car. The first 2 weeks were the kind of brutal that doesn't announce itself as dramatic. It was the brutality of small, relentless tasks, of waking up at 5 in the morning because the furnace in the farmhouse required lighting manually and went out in the night, of hauling water from the well to the house because the pipes had not been properly winterized and 3 of them had cracked, and the repair was a job she could not afford to hire out and was learning to do herself from videos she watched on her phone at night by flashlight when the generator she'd borrowed from her brother-in-law had enough fuel. It was the brutality of feeding Marcus and Lily on what she could stretch, of watching Marcus try to pretend the situation was better than it was, of watching Lily move through every new awful discovery as though it were material, notebook in hand, writing things down. The neighbors, such as they were, came in stages. The closest property was a working cattle farm 2 miles up the road, owned by a family named Dressler, who sent their teenage son over on the 3rd day with a covered plate of food and a look of poorly concealed curiosity. A woman from the county extension office came out on the 6th day, officially to discuss the land, unofficially to assess what she was clearly dealing with, and Ruth watched the woman work to keep her expression neutral while walking the property and felt the familiar shape of pity aimed in her direction like a slow-moving vehicle. In town, at the hardware store and the feed supply and the small grocery that was closer than the Piggly Wiggly, she heard the same low-grade disbelief in different voices. That Calloway woman moved out there with her kids. You heard that? Lord, what is she thinking? That place has been falling in for 30 years. Hollis should have sold it years ago, would have done everybody a kindness. She heard it, and she absorbed it, and she kept working. There were phone calls she did not answer because she already knew the shape of what they would say. Her sister called 3 times in the first week, each time leaving a voicemail that started gently and ended in the particular frustrated love that family members deploy when they want to say "I told you so," but are not quite willing to say it yet. Darlene called once, not to offer help, but to mention that she knew a realtor who specialized in distressed rural properties, as if the mention of the word distressed would do some work on Ruth's resolve. Gary texted a link to an article about the challenges of rural property rehabilitation that he had clearly found by searching for something designed to discourage exactly what Ruth was doing. Ruth read all of it. She listened to all of it. She set it down the way you set down a heavy thing you have been carrying and returned to a task that requires both hands. There was enough in the farmhouse to make it livable, barely. The kitchen was the best room, solid and square, with a cast-iron stove that still functioned and a well-made table that had outlasted everything else by virtue of being simple and well-built. Ruth scrubbed every surface in the house twice. She repaired the 2 most critical sections of the porch roof herself, climbing up there on a clear Saturday morning while Marcus held the ladder and Lily sat in the yard watching and writing. She reran the copper pipe in the worst section of the plumbing using tutorials and stubbornness and 3 trips to the hardware store. She caulked every window. She stuffed insulation into gaps in the exterior walls. She fixed the furnace. She made the household. And she waited, because she had learned from 6 weeks of calculations that she needed to understand what she had before she decided what to do with it. She needed to walk every acre of the 403 before she made another decision. She needed to know the land the way Hollis had known it, The way that kind of knowing only came from time and walking and paying attention. She started at the house and worked outward, a section at a time, in the early mornings before the children were up. The pasture land to the north was exhausted, as she had expected, the topsoil thin and depleted, the grass the kind that took hold in bad soil and meant that better grasses had been crowded out long ago. But the creek that ran along the northern boundary still ran clear, fed from somewhere higher, and the ground near it was darker and richer and told a different story from the rest. The woods on the eastern edge were old-growth timber, more of it than she had expected, and she walked them slowly, learning the spacing and the quality of the canopy. The lower fields to the south had better soil, she thought, though she would need tests to be sure, and the drainage was reasonable. And then there was the barn. She had been avoiding it. Not consciously, not entirely, but she had been finding other tasks to attend to each time she moved toward it. There was always something more urgent, something more immediately threatening to the livability of the house or the well-being of her children. The barn could wait. The barn was not going anywhere, but the barn was there. Every morning when she looked out the kitchen window over the cast-iron sink, it was there. Every evening when she stood on the repaired section of porch, it was there. Lily had drawn it 4 times in the back pages of her notebook. Marcus had walked around it once, cautiously, and reported that it smelled like something old, and that one section of the standing wall moved slightly when he pressed it, which Ruth had immediately told him never to do again. She went to it on a Thursday, 3 weeks after they arrived. The prop door was too heavy to move without help, so she found a way in through the gap between the collapsed section and the standing wall, a narrow passage where the fallen roof had created a lean-to effect against the remaining structure. She had a flashlight and her work gloves and the careful body language of someone who had learned to test surfaces before trusting them. Inside, what remained of the standing section of the barn was larger than it had seemed from outside. The interior space was roughly 40 feet deep and perhaps 30 feet wide, the walls rising to about 15 feet before the ceiling became the damaged roof, which admitted gray February light through several gaps. The floor was dirt, packed hard by decades of use, littered with the accumulated evidence of a working farm's long decline. Old rope, coils of it, stiff and darkened. Metal parts she could not identify, farm equipment components, rusted beyond recognition. Sections of wooden stall partition, dismantled and stacked against one wall. A hand-cranked seed spreader, still intact, its paint entirely gone. Feed bins of galvanized metal, some dented, some split at the seams. Along the far wall, a workbench of heavy planks on sawhorses, covered in tools she recognized, and some she did not, all of them rust-dulled and web-covered. She moved through the space slowly, testing the floor with each step, alert for soft spots or hollow sounds. The packed dirt was firm everywhere she tested it. She picked up things and set them down. Some of the tools on the bench were salvageable with cleaning. The rope was too far gone. The metal parts might have value as scrap. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She spent time at the workbench, sorting through what was salvageable from what was not. There were hand tools there that were older than she had expected, the kind of forged iron tools that predated the cheaper manufacture of the post-war years. A set of wood chisels with handles made from some dark wood she did not recognize, the blades still holding a degree of sharpness after all this time. A hand plane with a heavy cast body. An auger set in a leather roll, the leather dry and cracking, but the auger bits still true. These were tools made to last, made by someone who understood that quality was its own kind of economy, and she thought of Hollis again. Thought of the kind of man who kept tools like these and used them and maintained the knowledge of how to use them even as the farm around him slowly came apart. She found other things that told a different story. Ledger books, 2 of them, tucked into the back corner of the bench under a piece of burlap, so old it disintegrated when she lifted it. The paper inside had absorbed decades of barn dampness and the pages were swollen and fused in places, but she carefully separated a few and held them to the flashlight and read the entries in Hollis's handwriting, which she recognized from the birthday cards, tight and angled slightly to the left. The entries were old. The dates on the pages she could open range from the late 1950s through the mid-1970s, farm accounts, crop yields, equipment costs, animal records. The handwriting in the earliest entries was firmer, the record of a young man in his prime running a working operation. The later entries were different, the handwriting the same, but the entries sparser, the numbers smaller, the world of the ledger contracting as the farm itself contracted. She set the ledgers aside carefully. They were not what she had come to find, but they felt important in the way that any evidence of a life lived carefully and thoughtfully felt important. She was making her way toward the back corner of the barn when the flashlight caught the edge of something that made her stop. The floor of the barn was dirt. She had been walking on it for 15 minutes, and it was uniform, packed, the same deep brown throughout, marked here and there by old stain from spilled oil or feed or water, darkened and absorbed into the earth over decades. But in the far corner, behind the collapsed remains of what had been a partition wall, the floor looked different. She moved toward it, stepping over a section of fallen timber, and crouched down and put her hand on the surface. It was not dirt. She scraped at it with her gloved fingers, and the top layer came away, fine-grained and loose, and she understood that someone had spread soil over the surface here, a thin layer, deliberately, over something that was not dirt at all. She swept more of it away with her palm, and the surface beneath it caught the flashlight and reflected it back. Concrete. Old concrete, rough-poured, the kind made with aggregate that left a coarse texture. She cleared more of the loose soil and exposed a section roughly 4 feet by 4 feet, the edges of which she could make out clearly where the concrete met the packed earth of the barn floor around it. The transition was deliberate. Someone had poured this section separately, after the fact. She stood and shone the flashlight across the full extent of the corner, and the loose soil was everywhere here. She saw now, 6 inches deep in places, covering an area she could not immediately determine. She found a piece of flat scrap metal and used it to sweep systematically, clearing a section at a time, and what emerged beneath was not one slab but a large expanse of concrete, broken in 2 places by seams that ran parallel to each other, separated by about 2 feet. And those seams, she understood after a moment, were not cracks. They were intentional. They were the edges of something built to be opened. She was crouched on her heels in the corner of a collapsing barn with a flashlight in February, looking at a hatch set into the floor under a layer of soil deliberately placed to conceal it, and the sound the barn made around her was the sound of old wood in cold air, nothing more, nothing less. But something had changed in the quality of the silence, or perhaps it was just that her own breathing had changed. She did not open it that day. She told herself it was practical. She needed more light and better tools, and she needed to be certain the structure around her was stable before she committed herself to a corner of the barn with no clear second exit. She needed to think. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she looked at it. She had children in the farmhouse, and she was alone, and the sensible thing, the careful thing, was to step back and plan. She covered the concrete again with the loose soil, careful to leave no evidence of her sweep, and then she stood and looked at her own footprints in the dirt around her and understood that the footprints would have to stay. She could not erase them without making it obvious she had tried. She left them and walked back through the gap in the wall into the cold air outside. At lunch, Marcus asked her what she had found in the barn. She looked at him. He said, "You have your face on. The one from when you're thinking about something you're not saying." She said, "The floor is interesting. I'm going to look more carefully tomorrow." He looked at her the way 13-year-olds look at parents who are being deliberately vague, which is a look that combines contempt and concern in a ratio that shifts by the day. Lily said, "Interesting like how?" Ruth said, "Interesting like I want to look more carefully before I say anything." Lily opened her notebook and wrote something. Ruth did not ask what. That night, she sat at the kitchen table after the children were asleep and tried to approach the question the way she would approach any problem she did not yet have the information to solve. She did not allow herself to speculate beyond what she had observed. She had observed a concrete floor section in the corner of the barn, old poor, separate from the surrounding dirt floor, covered deliberately with a layer of loose soil. She had observed seams consistent with a hatch or door mechanism. She had observed that the concealment appeared deliberate and had been in place long enough for the soil layer to compress and for cobwebs to develop across the surface. She had observed nothing else. She thought about Darlene in the parking lot saying money pit. She thought about Gary muttering to his neighbor. She thought about the county extension woman with her carefully neutral face walking the exhausted pasture. She thought about every person who had said the Calloway place as if the name itself were a warning, and she thought about the fact that not one of them had ever really looked at it. Not closely, not with the patience that looking required. They had driven past it, or flown over it in their imaginations, or dismissed it from the safety of information they had inherited from other people who had also never looked closely. The assumption of worthlessness had a kind of momentum, a shared weight that made it feel like fact. But Ruth had learned, in 11 years of ringing up groceries and watching what people put on the belt and what they put back on the shelf, that what people assumed was worthless was often only what they hadn't looked at long enough to understand. She made a list of what she needed to do. She needed better lighting. She needed a pry bar. She needed to examine the seams more carefully to understand the mechanism. She needed to determine whether there was a lock or a handle buried beneath the soil she had not yet cleared. She needed, fundamentally, to go back. She also needed to consider that she was a woman alone on 400 acres of farmland with 2 children, and that if whatever was beneath that hatch was something that should not be found, the finding of it might have consequences. She had read both of those stories. She knew what they looked like. She knew the shape of a thing that has been deliberately hidden and what it meant when someone went to the trouble of hiding it. But she also knew that Hollis Calloway had left her this farm. Hollis, who had lived on this land for 40 years by himself and kept bees and grown a little corn and sat on his porch naming birds. Hollis, who had nobody visit him and still maintained the taxes as long as he could and kept the place against all reasonable advice for 30 years after it stopped being a working farm. Hollis, who had chosen her. She sat with that for a long time in the quiet kitchen. The cast-iron stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the wind moved through the dormant trees that stood between the house and the barn, and the sound it made was the sound of something breathing slowly and waiting. She had a question she could not yet answer, but she had decided something else in the barn that afternoon, standing over that covered concrete with her flashlight and her work gloves and her borrowed shovel. She had decided that she was not afraid of the answer. Whatever was beneath the floor of Hollis Calloway's barn, whatever had been placed there and covered and maintained in secrecy through the years of his long quiet life, she was not afraid of it. She was the woman who had repaired her own pipes and recaulked her own windows and climbed her own roof. She was the woman who had looked at $18,000 of debt on an abandoned property and moved her children there anyway. She was not afraid. She was back in the barn before sunrise the next morning, with the work lights from the Dressler boys' loan clipped to the intact section of the overhead beam, filling the space with the harsh white light that pushed the shadows all the way into the corners and left nowhere for uncertainty to sit. She swept the remaining loose soil methodically until the full extent of the concrete was clear, and what she found was larger than she had initially understood. The hatch covered a section approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, framed by a wooden border of heavy timber that had been set into the barn floor when the concrete was poured. The seams were clean, or had been. Age had narrowed them with accumulated dirt and a thin crust of mineral deposit, but they were still seams, still edges, still the shape of something meant to be opened. The mechanism was in the near corner of the hatch. She found it when she cleared the last of the soil from that section, and the flashlight caught the dull gray glint of iron. A hinged iron ring, about 4 inches in diameter, set flush into a circular recess in the timber framing. It had been blackened with something, oil or paint, long ago, enough to make it less visible in the general darkness of a barn floor, and then covered with the soil layer, and the combination had kept it from the casual eye for what she was already suspecting was a very long time. She gripped the ring with both gloved hands and pulled. The hatch did not open. She pulled again, repositioning her feet for leverage, and felt the resistance give slightly. Not the resistance of locked hardware, but the resistance of wood swollen by moisture and time and compressed by decades of neglect. She let go and examined the seams again with her fingers, clearing out the accumulated mineral crust with the edge of her pry bar, working slowly and carefully around the full perimeter. Then she tried again, this time with a long, slow groan that seemed to come from somewhere below as much as from the wood itself. The hatch shifted. The far edge lifted first, an inch, then 2, and cold air moved up through the gap. It was the cold of underground, of earth, of enclosed space kept from the light, and it carried a smell she recognized only distantly, something mineral and dry and very old. She held the hatch up with the pry bar wedged under the far edge and shone her flashlight into the darkness below. Steps. Wooden steps, 3 of them visible, descending into shadow. The walls of the space below were not dirt but stone, rough field stone set in mortar, and where the flashlight reached she could see the floor below, which was also stone, and the low ceiling of the chamber, which was perhaps 7 feet below the barn floor, and which was made of heavy timbers still intact, still solid, still bearing the weight of the barn and its years with a patience that spoke of having been built to do exactly that. She held her light there for a long moment, and looked at the stone chamber beneath her great uncle's barn and understood that it was not small. The steps were set at the near end of a space that extended beyond where her flashlight could reach. She looked up and looked around the barn as if seeing it fresh. The collapsed side. The decades of decline. The way the property had been allowed to fall apart in full view of everyone in the county. The Calloway place. A punchline. A cautionary tale. Worthless and obvious and not worth looking at too closely. She looked back down at the steps and the stone walls and the darkness below, and something moved in her chest that was not quite hope, but was in the neighborhood of it. Something with weight to it. Something that had been sitting in the earth beneath this barn for longer than she had been alive, waiting with the patience of stone. She put her foot on the first step. The wood held. It was old and dry despite the underground cold, and it held her weight without complaint. She went down the second step, then the third, and as she descended below the level of the barn floor, the stone walls came up around her, and the smell of the underground space thickened, mineral and dry and enclosed, and the work lights above threw her shadow down the stairs ahead of her, and she followed it. The chamber was not what she had expected. She had been telling herself, on the walk back from the house, on the short drive in her mind between the kitchen table and the barn, that she was not expecting anything in particular, that she was simply going to look, that the sensible thing, the only real thing, was to see what was there before she assigned it any meaning. But there is a version of not expecting that is really a kind of hoping, and she understood as she reached the bottom of the stairs and straightened and swept her flashlight in a slow arc across the space that she had been hoping, without letting herself know it, for something that mattered. The chamber was roughly the size of the farmhouse kitchen, perhaps larger. The ceiling was the underside of the barn floor supported by heavy timber beams, and it cleared her head by nearly a foot. The walls were the same rough field stone throughout, dry mortared, well-made, the work of someone who had known how to build things to last. The floor was flat stone, not quarried but collected, fitted together with a care that spoke of long patient labor. Against the far wall were shelves, built of the same heavy timber as the barn above, for rows of them, floor to ceiling, running the full width of the space. She moved toward them, and the flashlight found what was on them, and she stopped. The shelves were not empty. They were not storage for old farm equipment or forgotten tools or the accumulated debris of a long and diminishing life. What was on them had been placed deliberately, organized with a care and precision that was unmistakable even in the first moment of the flashlight's crossing them. She swept the beam from left to right and back again, slowly, and what she was seeing began to assemble itself into something her mind could hold. Wooden crates, sealed with metal banding, stacked on the lower shelves. Canvas bags, their mouths tied with cord, their surfaces marked with faded writing she could not yet read. Metal containers of various sizes, their lids tight, their surfaces lacquered against moisture. And on the upper shelves, wrapped in oilcloth, tied in place with leather cord, rows and rows of what she could only understand, at this moment, with this light, with this much space between what she had believed and what she was now seeing, as objects that had been stored here with an intention she had not begun to understand. She stood in the cold underground chamber beneath her great uncle's barn, and the flashlight trembled slightly in her hand, and she steadied it consciously, the way she had steadied her voice at the wheel reading and her hands on the water pipe fittings and her body on the porch roof with Marcus below and the wind moving through the February air. She steadied it, and she looked. And she understood, in the way that understanding sometimes comes before reasoning, before the words arrive to carry it, that the worthless farm was not worthless, that Hollis Calloway had known what he had, that the long quiet years of decline and the collapsed barn and the warped porch and the joke of a property that everyone in the county had agreed wasn't worth serious attention had been, in some way she was only beginning to see the outline of deliberate. A cover. a kind of camouflage that had worked for decades, on everyone who had looked and seen only what they expected to see. Everyone except her. She had come down the stairs, and she had not gone back up. She stood in the stone chamber with the cold rising through the floor into her feet, and the flashlight steady in her hand, and she looked at what Hollis had left her, and she did not yet know what it was worth, did not yet know the full story of how it came to be here, did not yet know what it would mean for Marcus and Lily and the apartment she had left and the credit card she was afraid to look at and the $18,000 of back taxes and lien. But she knew one thing with a certainty that was almost physical. Hollis Calloway had not left her nothing. He had left her everything. She stood there for a long time in that stone quiet, with the weight of the barn above her and the cold of the earth beneath her feet, and the flashlight casting its plain white light over decades of carefully kept secret. She was going to need help understanding what she was looking at. She was going to need experts, appraisers, people who knew things she did not know. She was going to need to be careful, very careful, about who she told and when and how. She understood that as clearly as she had ever understood anything, standing in the half-dark below the surface of the farm that everyone had agreed was worthless. She was going to need to think. But first she needed to go back up the stairs, back up into the barn, through the gap in the fallen wall, across the yard to the farmhouse where Marcus was probably doing something useful and Lily was almost certainly writing about the crow. She needed to close the hatch and cover it, and let the ordinary morning continue around the barn the way it had been continuing for however many years this had been sitting here beneath everyone's notice. She turned toward the steps, and then stopped, and turned back once more, because she could not help it. She swept the flashlight one final time across the shelves and the crates, and the oilcloth-wrapped rows on the upper shelves, and the organized, patient, deliberate weight of what Hollis had kept here and trusted to no one until he trusted it to her. And she said, low and quiet in the stone chamber, to no one who was there, and perhaps to someone who wasn't, I'm going to figure out what this is, Hollis. I promise you that. The steps held on the way up, too. She came out into the barn, and the cold February air and the ordinary gray light of a Kentucky morning. And she lowered the hatch, and pressed it flush, and covered it with the loose soil, and turned off the work lights, and walked back to the farmhouse. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the barn, which looked exactly as it had always looked from the outside, sagging and ruined and not worth serious attention, and she understood for the first time something that Hollis Calloway had apparently understood for a very long time. Sometimes the best hiding place is the thing nobody thinks is worth looking at. She did not tell the children that day. She made lunch, which was grilled cheese on the cast-iron skillet and canned tomato soup, and she sat at the table and watched Marcus eat with the focused efficiency of a growing boy, and watched Lily hold her spoon in the wrong hand, because her right hand was busy writing something in the notebook she had propped against her glass. And she thought about the stone chamber and the shelves and the crates, and she said nothing. She asked Marcus how the wood was holding up in the stove, and he said fine. She asked Lily what she was writing, and Lily said, descriptions of things, and Ruth said, what kinds of things, and Lily said, textures mostly, and went back to writing. The ordinary lunch held itself together around the secret the way ordinary things do. They have no idea, Ruth thought. And then, more slowly, neither do I. Not yet. What she knew was this. The chamber was real, and it was old, and it was deliberate, and it contained things that had been placed there with care by someone who understood what they were doing. Beyond that, she knew nothing useful. She needed to understand what was in the crates before she could understand anything else, and she needed to do that methodically, without rushing, and she needed to do it alone or close to alone until she knew what she was dealing with. That was the first principle. Move slowly. Confirm before you conclude. She had learned that from 11 years of inventory discrepancies and customer complaints in situations that looked one way from a distance and turned out, up close, to be something else entirely. She gave herself 2 days to prepare. She spent the first day at the county library, where she found books on rural property history, on agricultural storage practices of the early 20th century, on the kinds of items that were commonly secreted in farm structures during the Depression years and the war years when institutional trust was low and people hid what they valued in the earth rather than in banks. She read carefully, taking notes on her phone, building a framework for what she might be about to find. The second day she spent at the farm supply store in town, where she bought the best flashlight they carried, and at the hardware store, where she found a pry bar of the right size and a set of brushes and a roll of clean cotton cloth. She bought nothing that would draw questions. She paid cash. She also, on the second day, made a phone call she had been circling around since she came back up the stairs from the chamber. His name was Earl Combs, and she had known him vaguely for most of her life without knowing him well, the way you know people in a county where families have been for generations. He was in his mid-60s, a retired agricultural assessor who had spent 30 years evaluating rural properties for the county and who was known, by reputation, as a man who kept his mouth shut about what he saw in the course of his work. He had a side interest in local history that had led him, over the years, to develop a broad familiarity with the kinds of objects that surfaced on old farms, what they were, what they meant, what they were worth. Her brother-in-law had mentioned his name once in a conversation about the farm, not as a recommendation but as a passing reference, and Ruth had stored it in the part of her mind where she kept things she might need later. She called him from the farmhouse kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon and told him she had found something on the property she had inherited and that she needed an opinion from someone who understood rural history and who would not talk about what he saw. There was a pause on the line. Then Earl Combs said, "What kind of something?" She said, "I'd rather you see it yourself before I try to describe it." Another pause. He said, "When do you want me to come?" She told him Thursday morning. She spent Wednesday evening in the barn alone. She had told Marcus she was checking the standing wall section for structural stability, which was not untrue. She brought the new flashlight and the brushes and the cotton cloth, and she went back down the stairs into the chamber, and she spent 2 hours working slowly and systematically, clearing the loose dirt from around the nearest stack of crates and studying them without opening anything. She was learning the space the way she had learned to learn new things in her life, from the outside in, establishing the boundary before she moved to the center. The crates were uniform in construction, built from a dense grain which she thought might be white oak, jointed with a precision that suggested either a very skilled hand or manufactured production. Each one was sealed with metal banding, the kind that had been crimped in place with a specialized tool, and the crimps were still tight, still holding, which told her the sealing had been done with care and with material chosen to last. The surfaces of the crates were darkened with age, but not rotted, not compromised. Whatever had gone into choosing the wood, and the sealing method and the location of the chamber had been done by someone who understood preservation. The underground temperature was stable. The stone walls breathed slowly. The chamber was, she realized, naturally climate-controlled in the way that underground stone structures in this part of Kentucky often were, and whoever built it had understood that. She counted 12 crates on the lower shelves. She counted 22 canvas bags on the middle shelves, each one tied at the mouth with cord, each one bearing faded markings in ink that had spread slightly into the canvas over the years, the writing still legible enough to identify, but not to fully read in this light. She counted the oilcloth-wrapped objects on the upper shelves and lost count at 30, because they varied in size and the wrapping made their shapes ambiguous. She stood in the middle of the chamber and turned slowly, taking it in, and what she felt was not excitement, not yet, but something closer to reverence. The careful preservation of this much, for this long, by a man as outwardly unremarkable as Hollis Calloway, was itself remarkable. Whatever this was, it had been worth protecting. Hollis had spent a lifetime protecting it. She went back upstairs. She replaced the hatch and covered it, and walked back to the farmhouse and made supper, and put the children to bed and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time without turning on the light. Earl Combs arrived at 7:30 Thursday morning in a truck that was older than hers and better maintained, which she noticed and appreciated. He was a compact man with a gray mustache and the hands of someone who had spent decades in fields and outbuildings, broad and careful and accustomed to the weight of things. He said good morning and looked at the farm with the practiced eye of someone who had assessed hundreds of properties and had learned to see past the surface of them to the structure underneath. He said nothing about the state of the barn or the farmhouse. He said, "Where are we going?" She took him to the barn. She showed him the gap in the fallen wall, and he went through it without difficulty and stood in the interior of the standing section and was quiet for a moment, reading the space the way she had learned to read it, slowly, with attention. She showed him the ledger books on the workbench. He picked one up and looked at the entries and set it back down carefully. Then she cleared the loose soil from the hatch, and he watched her do it without speaking. When the ring was exposed, he crouched and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked up at her. He said, "When did you find this?" She said, "Last week." He said, "Have you opened the crates?" She said, "Not yet. I wanted to understand what I was looking at first." He nodded once, the kind of nod that means that was the right decision. Then he stood and helped her lift the hatch. They went down together. She held the flashlight. He stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, the way she had turned, and she watched his face and learned from it. Earl Combs had, in his 30 years of agricultural assessment, seen the accumulated material of dozens of farms, had handled estate goods and salvage, and the detritus of lives long finished. She could see him working through his experience, placing what he was seeing against everything he had seen before, testing and evaluating. His expression did not change dramatically, but something shifted in it, a quality of attention that sharpened. He walked to the nearest crate on the lower shelf and examined the banding without touching it. He looked at the wood. He leaned in close and sniffed, which surprised her. He said, "Oak. White oak, I think." He looked at the sealing method and said, "This was done with a commercial banding tool, not a farm tool. Someone brought equipment specifically for this." He looked at the canvas bags and bent close to read the faded markings on the nearest one. He straightened slowly. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "Do you have a pry bar?" She handed him the pry bar. He worked the banding on the nearest crate with the slow patience of a man who understood that what he might be about to open could not be unopened, and that fact deserved some respect. The banding released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. He set it aside and worked the lid of the crate with the same patience, easing it up from the corners rather than forcing it, and the lid came free. Inside, packed in straw that had dried to the texture of paper but had held its structure, were coins. Not a handful, not a small collection. The coins were sorted into cylindrical paper rolls, stacked horizontally in rows, filling the crate from base to lid. Each roll was marked in pencil, the marking faded but legible. Earl Combs reached in with 2 fingers and extracted one roll and held it up and peeled the paper back from one end. The coins inside were gold. He held one up to the flashlight, and she could see the profile pressed into the metal, the date below it. He turned it over. He was quiet again. He said, "These are St. Gaudens's double eagles." He said it the way you say the name of something you recognize and have not seen in a long time, with a quality of familiarity that had in it both recognition and distance. She did not know what that meant. He could see that she didn't. He said, "They're gold coins. $20 gold pieces. This particular design was minted from 1907 until 1933. He turned the coin to read the date. This one's from 1924. He looked at the rows of paper rolls in the crate. Each of these rolls probably holds 20 coins. He looked at how many rolls filled the crate. There are roughly 40 rolls in this crate alone. She did math in her head, and her heart rate changed. He replaced the coin in the roll and the roll in the crate. He moved to the canvas bags and untied the cord on the nearest one and looked inside without reaching in. He said, "Silver dollars." He moved along the shelf and read the markings on 3 more bags. He went to the upper shelf and unwrapped the corner of one of the oilcloth packages. He looked at what was inside for a moment and then folded the oilcloth back over it with care. He turned to face her. He said, "Ruth, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about your answer carefully before you give it. Did Hollis Calloway ever talk to you about his family's history? About where the farm came from, or what his parents or grandparents did before him?" She said, "Not in detail. He talked about the farm sometimes. He said it had been in the family since before the First World War." Earl Combs nodded slowly. Then he said, "Because what I'm looking at down here tells a story." He paused, as if deciding how much of the story to tell at once. There were men in this part of Kentucky in the 1920s and 30s who did not trust the banking system. They had reasons. Some of those reasons were personal, some were political, and some of them were proven correct in 1929 when the banks began to fail and people who had put their faith in institutions found their savings gone. Some of those men, particularly men with farms that produced well and had some surplus to preserve, converted what they had into physical assets. Gold, silver, things that held value outside of a system they didn't trust. They put those assets in the ground, literally, because the ground was what they understood and the ground was what they trusted. He looked around the chamber. This was built by someone who trusted the ground. She said, "How much are we talking about?" Earl Combs looked at the shelves again. He scratched the back of his neck, which she already understood was a gesture he made when he was being careful about what he was about to say. He said, "I'm not a numismatist. I can't give you a figure that means anything without a proper appraisal. Gold coins from this era, pre-1933, are worth considerably more than face value and considerably more than spot gold price. The St. Gaudens double eagles in particular, depending on condition and date, can be worth several hundred to several $1,000s per coin. And there are a lot of coins in this room." He looked at the bags. "The silver is worth less per unit, but there appear to be a lot of units. And those," he nodded toward the upper shelf, "those I'd need an expert for. I recognized what they are, but pricing them isn't something I can do." She said, "What are they?" He said, "Stock certificates. Or at least some of them. Old ones. Some of them could be worthless, decorative, companies that no longer exist. But some of them, depending on the issuer and the date, could be valid instruments." She was going to need a specialist for those as well. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She stood in the stone chamber with Earl Combs and the flashlight, and she tried to hold the shape of what he was telling her without it collapsing into something she couldn't manage. She said, "All right, what do I do next?" He said, "Next you call a professional numismatist for the coins and a securities historian for the certificates. You do not tell anyone else about this. Not family, not neighbors, not the county assessor's office, not anyone. Not until you understand the full value and not until you have legal advice about how to handle it correctly." He paused. "I mean that seriously, Ruth. What you have here could change the nature of your relationship with a lot of people in a way you are not prepared for. Scarcity is the only protection you have right now." She said, "I haven't told anyone." He said, "Good. Keep it that way." He came back up the stairs before she did and stood in the barn while she replaced the hatch and covered it. He did not speak again until they were outside in the February morning, standing in the gray yard between the barn and the farmhouse. He said, "I know a man in Lexington who appraises estate coins. His name is Philip Greer. He's not related to your family's lawyer, I don't think, though it's a common enough name in this part of the state. He's careful and he's honest, and he doesn't talk. I can make an introduction if you want it." She said yes. He said, "He'll need to come out here and see it in context. You don't want to start moving things until you understand what you have and what moving it means legally. Property found on inherited land is generally yours, but there are specifics that depend on how it was stored and when and by whom. And you'll want a lawyer who understands estate and property law to advise you before anything leaves this barn. Can you afford a lawyer?" She thought about $412. She said, "I'll find a way." He looked at her steadily. "I know someone for that, too. She's in Frankfurt. She does estate work. I'll reach out." She thanked him. He said not to thank him yet. He drove his old truck back down the gravel road, and she stood in the yard and watched it go and felt the particular quality of loneliness that comes when you are holding something enormous alone and the person who helped you hold it for a moment has just left. Inside, Lily was at the kitchen table with her notebook and a cup of hot chocolate she had made herself, which meant she had been standing on the step stool to reach the stovetop, and Ruth was going to have a conversation about that. She looked at her daughter's face, bent over the page, pen moving, and she thought, "I am trying to change your life. I am standing out here in February on a farm that doesn't work, trying to change the story you're going to have to tell about where you came from and how things turned out." She thought, "Hollis, I hope you knew what you were doing." Then she went in and sat down and put her hand on Lily's shoulder and looked at what she was writing, which was a description of frost on the window glass that was so precise it was like looking at the frost itself. And she said, "That's beautiful, baby," and Lily said, "I know." Philip Greer arrived 11 days later. He was a small, careful man of about 60 with round glasses and the kind of unhurried attention in his hands that you saw in people who handled valuable things for a living. He came in a car that was unremarkable in every respect, the choice, Ruth suspected, of someone who had learned that arriving in an expensive vehicle at a location where you were about to assess valuable objects was a way of beginning a negotiation you had not intended to begin. He wore plain clothes. He carried a case that looked like a fishing tackle box. He shook her hand and said, "Earl speaks well of you." And she said, "Earl was kind." And he said, "Earl's not kind, he's accurate," which was the same thing in his experience. She took him to the barn. He went through the gap in the wall, without hesitation, and stood in the interior and looked at everything around him for a long time before he said a single word. Then he said, "How old is this structure?" She said, "Built in the 20s, she believed, from the original property records." He nodded. He said, "I can see that." He crouched and touched the floorboard with his palm. Then she showed him the hatch. He went down the stairs and stood in the chamber and was silent for what felt like 4 or 5 minutes. He turned his head slowly, taking in the shelves and the crates and the bags and the oilcloth-wrapped packages on the upper rows. He set his tackle case on the floor and opened it and removed a jeweler's loupe and a pair of white cotton gloves and a small LED magnification light and a notebook with a worn cover. He said, "This is going to take a while." Ruth said, "I have nowhere to be." He worked methodically, beginning with the crates. He examined the banding, the wood, the seal integrity. He opened the crate that Earl had opened before and extracted a roll of coins with his gloved hands and unrolled it on the flat stone lid of a container below the shelf and worked through the coins one at a time, holding each one under his magnification light, reading the dates, noting the mint marks, examining the surfaces with the loupe. He said nothing while he worked. His pen moved across the notebook. He opened 2 more crates, different coins in one, the same type in another, and worked through them with the same patience. Then he moved to the canvas bags. He untied 3 of them and spread samples of the contents on the clean cloth he had brought from his case and worked through them the same way. Silver dollars, Morgan dollars, Peace dollars, seeded Liberty dollars, older ones Ruth couldn't name. He sorted them into groups that meant something to him by some internal taxonomy she could not yet follow. He wrote constantly in his notebook. He spent 40 minutes on the oilcloth-wrapped packages on the upper shelves, unwrapping each one carefully, recording what he found, rewrapping it before moving to the next. These, Ruth had come to understand from the 2 weeks of waiting and reading, were the most complex element. Earl had said stock certificates, and he had been right about some of them, but there were other things up there too. Documents that Philip Greer handled with a particular quality of careful attention that was different from his handling of the others, as if these required not just precision but a kind of deference. He said nothing about them while he worked. His pen kept moving. When he was done, he stood and removed his gloves and folded them into his case and snapped it shut. He looked at his notebook. He looked at Ruth. He said, "I'm going to give you preliminary ranges only. These are not appraisal values. These are initial estimates based on visual assessment and will require confirmation with full documentation and in some cases laboratory authentication." She said she understood. He said, "The gold coins." She counted 12 crates when she had her first look, and he had confirmed 12 crates on the lower shelves. Each crate contained between 35 and 45 rolls of coins. Each roll contained between 15 and 25 coins. The coins were primarily St. Gaudens double eagles from the period 1907 through 1932, with representation across most years in that range. Several dates were present in sufficient quantity to suggest systematic collection rather than casual accumulation. He named 3 specific dates that carried a premium in the current market due to their relative scarcity. He said the condition on most of the coins was good to very good, which was the result of the storage conditions and the paper roll method, which had protected the surfaces from contact damage. He said the gold content alone, at current spot price, would value the coin collection in the range of $3 to $4 million. He said that the numismatic premium on pre-1933 gold coins of this quality and date range would put the actual market value considerably higher, in the range of $6 to $10 million for the full collection, depending on the market at time of sale. Ruth sat down on the bottom stair. She had not meant to sit down. Her legs had made the decision for her. He continued. The silver was more variable in value. The Morgan and Peace dollar collection was large, several thousand coins by his estimate, and the condition ranged from good to excellent. The numismatic value of the silver, taken as a collection, was in the range of $400,000 to $700,000, with specific dates possibly pushing that figure higher upon detailed analysis. He said he would need to count and document the full silver collection before giving a tighter range. She was looking at the floor. He said, "I need you to hear the next part." She looked up. He said, "The items on the upper shelves are not primarily stock certificates, though there are some of those and some of them may have redemption value. Most of what is on those shelves is something else." He paused, choosing his words. "There are, In those packages, maps, surveying documents, property deeds. He looked at her steadily. There are deeds to parcels of land in this county and 3 adjacent counties, going back in some cases to the 19th century. Some of them reference parcels that were subsequently acquired by other parties through what may have been irregular transactions during the Depression era when property changed hands under financial duress. The legal implications of those documents, if they are authentic, are significant and complex and entirely outside my area of expertise. You need a property and estate attorney who specializes in historical land claims, and you need one before anyone else sees those documents. She said, "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He said, "I'm saying that the coins and the silver are relatively straightforward in terms of ownership. They were on property that Hollis Calloway owned and that he left to you. And that means they are almost certainly yours to do with as you see fit, subject to proper legal process. The documents are a different matter. The documents tell a story about land that may extend beyond the boundaries of this farm, and the resolution of that story will require expertise and time." He closed his notebook. "I don't want to overstate this," he said. "Some of those deeds may be fully settled, fully resolved, representing land that was legally transferred decades ago and where no claim exists. Others may not be. It will take time to determine which is which." She sat on the bottom stair of the stone chamber in the cold underground quiet and looked at the shelves with their crates and their bags and their oilcloth packages. 12 crates of gold coins, several thousand silver dollars, documents whose value she could not yet calculate and whose implications she was only beginning to grasp. She said, "Hollis, I didn't know." Philip Greer said, "Very few people knew Hollis Calloway at all, from what I understand." He said it without judgment. He said, "The people who hid things in the ground during the Depression were often not people who advertised the fact. They were private people. They did not trust easily. And in many cases, the thing they were most careful to keep secret was not the wealth itself, but the history attached to it." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Someone built this chamber. Someone filled it. Someone maintained the property in a state of apparent worthlessness for decades, which is itself a form of maintenance. Because the best protection for something you want no one to find is to make the containers so unappealing that no one looks. And then someone left it." He looked at her. Hollis Calloway was 81 years old. He had no family close enough to trust. He had been sitting on this for, by my estimate, his entire adult life. "And he left it to you." She said, "Why me?" Philip Greer picked up his case. He said, "That's not a question I can answer." He looked at the chamber one more time, slowly. "I can tell you that whatever his reasons were, he thought carefully about them. Everything in this room was thought about carefully." He turned toward the stairs. "I'll have a written preliminary assessment to you within the week. Use it to find your attorney. And Ruth," he said, his hand on the stair rail, "no one else comes down here. Not yet. Not until you have legal representation and a documented chain of evidence. Promise me that." She said, "I promise." He went up the stairs and through the barn and back to his unremarkable car, and she listened to him drive away down the gravel road, and then she was alone in the chamber again with the flashlight and the shelves and the smell of old stone. She sat for a long time. She thought about Hollis naming birds from the porch and Lily writing the names in her notebook. She thought about the birthday cards with the 20s folded inside. She thought about 30 years of the Calloway place as a punchline. She thought about Darlene in the parking lot saying, "You know, that place is nothing but a money pit," and she almost laughed, or almost cried, or did something that was in the space between them. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She did not tell the children that night. She told Marcus the next morning, early, before Lily was up. She sat him at the kitchen table and put a cup of tea in front of him even though he didn't drink tea, because having something to hold with your hands made certain conversations easier, and she told him what she had found and what Earl Combs had seen and what Philip Greer had said. She told him as clearly and directly as she could because he was 13 and deserved clarity, and because she needed someone to know and he was the person she trusted most in the world. He sat very still through all of it. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he looked at his cup of tea, and then he looked at her, and he said, "So Dad left us something real." She had not said it that way. She said, "Hollis left me something. I don't know the full shape of it yet. I'm telling you because you live here and because things are going to start moving and I need you to understand what's happening. But Marcus, no one can know. Not your friends from home, not anyone at school, not the Dressler boy. Not until I have an attorney and we understand this legally. He said, I know, Mom. She said, I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. He said, I know. Lily, when she woke and came to the kitchen and found them both sitting at the table looking at her with that particular shared expression, said immediately, what happened? Ruth said, I'll tell you this evening. Lily looked at Marcus. He shrugged in the careful way. Lily sat down and opened her notebook and said, fine, and started writing, which was how she processed things she had to wait for. Ruth looked at her daughter's bent head and thought, Hollis, I will not waste this. I swear to you, I will not waste this. The attorney was a woman named Patricia Alcorn who drove from Frankfurt in a car that was expensive in a quiet way and wore clothes that were professional in a way that was easy to overlook, which Ruth recognized as a deliberate choice. Earl Combs had described her as the best estate and property attorney in the state for anything involving historical land claims, and the best person to have in your corner when other people started trying to take things that were yours. Ruth had understood from the way he said it that the second quality was going to matter as much as the first. Patricia Alcorn went down into the chamber on her first visit and came back up without saying anything for a full 2 minutes. Then she said, all right, here is what we are going to do. She laid it out in sequence, precise and calm, the way Ruth imagined surgeons briefed before an operation. The coins and silver were likely unambiguous property under Kentucky estate law, being found on inherited land, but they needed to be formally inventoried and documented before any transaction occurred, and ideally before any information about them left the property. That would take 2 to 3 weeks, with Philip Greer leading the numismatic documentation. The documents on the upper shelf were a different conversation, one she wanted to have after she had had time to examine them herself with a historical property specialist she would bring. She said she would need a retainer. Ruth told her what she could access, which was not much, and Patricia Alcorn said, Earl told me your situation. We'll work on contingency for now. If this is what Philip Greer thinks it is, the fee is not going to be a problem. Then she said, I want to ask you directly. Have you told anyone about this outside of Earl Combs and Philip Greer? Ruth said no. Patricia said, not Darlene Calloway? Not Gary? Not any of the family members who were present at the will reading? Ruth said no, she had told no one. Patricia nodded. She said, good. Because the moment anyone in that family hears a figure, the situation changes. People who were perfectly content to watch you take on an $18,000 tax liability on a worthless farm become very interested in the terms of the will the moment they understand the farm is not worthless. She paused. Hollis was under no obligation to explain his choices to anyone. Neither are you. But you need to be prepared for the fact that when this becomes known, and it will become known, some of those people are going to feel that they have been wronged. They have not been wronged. The will was clear and legal and properly executed. But feeling wronged and being wronged have never had much relationship to each other in matters of inheritance. Ruth said, I know. Patricia looked at her steadily. Good. Then let's get to work. The next 3 weeks were the most carefully structured weeks of Ruth's life. Philip Greer came back 3 times, each visit longer than the last, working through the inventory with a graduate student assistant who had signed a confidentiality agreement and whose academic focus on 19th and 20th century American numismatics meant that she was, as Philip put it, exactly the right person for this work, and also someone who understood that the right person for this work kept her mouth shut. Patricia Alcorn brought her historical property specialist, a professor from the University of Kentucky who specialized in land title disputes, and he spent an entire day in the chamber with the documents from the upper shelves and came back up looking like a man who had just found something in a library he had been looking for 20 years. He said to Patricia, quietly but not quietly enough that Ruth missed it, this is remarkable. Patricia said, remarkable how? He said, remarkably complicated. Patricia said, can we establish clear title? He said he needed more time. The children adapted to the rhythm of visitors the way children adapt to new routines when the routines are explained to them. Marcus understood the stakes and kept them with a steadiness that continued to surprise her. Lily wrote about everything she could observe without knowing what it meant, and Ruth read the entries sometimes and found in them a record of these weeks that was more accurate in its details than anything she could have managed herself. Lily wrote about the way Philip Greer's hands moved. She wrote about the way Patricia Alcorn stood in the yard after each visit and looked at her phone with an expression Lily described as someone reading a map of a country they have never visited. She wrote about the cold, about the way the barn looked in the late afternoon light, about the crow she had named, which was still coming for its daily offering and which she had begun to suspect was smarter than most of the adults she knew. The inventory, when Philip completed it at the end of the third week, ran to 47 pages. He presented it to Ruth and Patricia in the farmhouse kitchen on a Saturday morning while Marcus sat at the end of the table and Lily sat in the next room, but left the door open. Philip Greer read from the summary pages, and his voice was the voice of someone who had spent his career assigning numbers to things and had learned to deliver large numbers with the same measured tone he delivered small ones. The gold coin collection, fully documented, comprised 488 rolls of coins, totaling approximately 9,140 individual pieces, across 17 date varieties of the St. Gaudens double eagle and several lesser represented types. The condition graded consistently good to very fine across the collection, with a subset of approximately 1,200 coins grading fine to extremely fine. The estimated market value of the gold coin collection, based on current spot gold prices and the numismatic premium for pre-1933 coinage in these grades, was between $8 and $14 million. Ruth put her hand flat on the table. The silver dollar collection, comprising Morgan, Peace, and earlier seeded Liberty varieties, totaled just under 7,000 coins, with the condition ranging more variably, but with a significant portion grading fine or above. The estimated market value of the silver was between $600,000 and $1.2 million. Philip paused. He looked at his notes. He said, "The items on the upper shelves require separate treatment." He had been in contact with the professor from UK and with two additional specialists Patricia had brought in, one in historical securities and one in land title documentation. He said what he could say at this stage, which was that among the oilcloth packages they had found, in addition to the property documents whose status was still being analyzed, 17 items that had been identified as bearer bonds, issued between 1919 and 1938 by a combination of corporate and municipal issuers. Several of those bonds were with companies that no longer existed. Several were with municipalities that did. The question of whether the extant ones remained valid instruments was a legal question, not a numismatic one. But the securities specialist had expressed the opinion that at least 4 of the 17 bonds were likely valid and potentially negotiable, and that the combined face value of those 4 was considerable. She said, "How considerable?" Philip said, "Face value of the 4 potentially valid bonds totals approximately $2.3 million. Current redemption value, with accrued interest and depending on the issuing party's position, could be significantly higher." He said he did not want to speculate on the redemption value without more legal analysis. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the crow called from the elm tree, once, then again. Patricia Alcorn said, "I want to speak to the property documents before we get into the bond analysis, because those may be the most complex part of this, and you need to understand the scope of what we're potentially dealing with." Ruth looked at her. She said, "All right." Patricia said, "Among the documents on the upper shelves are 63 property instruments, including original deeds, conveyance records, and quitclaim deeds, relating to parcels of land in Harlan County and 3 adjacent counties. The professor has reviewed all 63. 41 of them relate to parcels that have clear subsequent title chains, meaning the land changed hands and documented, apparently legitimate transactions after these instruments were created. And while there are irregularities in some of those transactions that might be worth examining, the likelihood of successfully establishing a claim on those parcels is low, and the cost of pursuing it would probably exceed any potential recovery." She paused. "But 22 of those instruments are different," she said. "The 22 relate to parcels where the subsequent title history is incomplete or irregular in ways that matter legally. Some of them appear to document transactions that occurred under duress during the Depression, when families were losing farms to bank foreclosure or tax sale, and the records were sometimes not properly kept. Some of them relate to land where the chain of title was never fully clarified and where Hollis Calloway, or his family before him, appear to have maintained a documented interest that was never formally extinguished." She looked at Ruth steadily. What I am telling you is that we may have a legitimate claim to land beyond the 403 acres you inherited. I cannot tell you how much land. I cannot tell you the current value. That analysis will take months. But the professor's opinion, preliminary and subject to revision, is that the strongest of these 22 instruments relate to parcels totaling somewhere between 300 and 500 additional acres in this county alone. Ruth looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She said, Hollis. Marcus, from his end of the table, said very quietly, Dad knew all of this. Patricia said, someone in the Calloway family knew this. Whether it was Hollis himself or whether he inherited the knowledge along with the chamber, we can't say yet. What we can say is that this was organized, maintained, and preserved deliberately over a long period of time by someone who understood its value and wanted it to survive. From the next room, Lily said, without coming through the door, I wrote something yesterday that I think I understand now. Ruth said, what did you write, baby? Lily said, I wrote that the barn looks like it was built to fall down on purpose, so nobody would look underneath it. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then Patricia Alcorn looked at Ruth and said, your daughter is perceptive. Ruth said, I know. Lily appeared in the doorway with her notebook. She looked at her mother. She said, it's a big number, isn't it? Ruth said yes. Lily nodded once, the way someone nods when a thing they suspected has been confirmed, and went back to her chair and opened her notebook and began writing. Ruth watched her go and thought of Hollis on the porch naming the birds and Lily writing the names down in her careful hand, and something in her chest that had been held tight for a very long time finally, slowly, began to release. She did not know yet what would come next. She did not know how the family would react when this became known, and it would become known, Patricia had said so clearly. She did not know what the property claims would yield, or what the bonds would resolve to, or what the full picture of Hollis Calloway's long secret life would look like once it was fully exposed to light. She did not know any of that yet. But she looked at the 47 pages of inventory on her kitchen table, and she looked at the attorney who was already on her side, and she looked at her son who was steady as stone, and she looked at the doorway where her daughter was writing, and she understood that whatever came next, she was not facing it with nothing. She was facing it with everything Hollis had trusted her to carry, and she was going to carry it well. She put her hand on the inventory and held it there for a moment. Then she said, all right, Patricia, tell me what comes next. What came next, Patricia explained, was a sequence of steps that would take months and require patience that was different from the patience Ruth had exercised so far. The patience of concealment, of holding a secret in a property that looked worthless, was passive patience. What came now was active patience, the harder kind, the kind that required moving forward on multiple fronts, simultaneously and resisting the pressure to go faster than the process allowed. The coins and silver needed to be fully cataloged and authenticated, a process that Philip Greer estimated would take another 6 to 8 weeks with his full team. The bonds needed legal research to determine which were negotiable and what the redemption process looked like, which could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, depending on the responsiveness of the institutional parties involved. The property claims needed a full title search on each of the 22 parcels, conducted by Patricia's firm in consultation with the professor, and that was a year-long process at minimum for the most complex cases. Ruth said, and in the meantime? Patricia said, in the meantime the coins and the silver stay in the chamber. We document, we authenticate, and when we are ready, we move them to a bonded facility under custody documentation. Nothing leaves this property without documentation. Nothing enters this conversation without a confidentiality agreement. She looked at Ruth over the edge of her glasses. And you continue living here. You continue working your land. You do not buy a new car. You do not pay off the back taxes in a lump sum that would raise questions. You do not change anything about the surface of your life that would signal to anyone paying attention that the situation has changed. She paused. Can you do that? Ruth thought about the credit card she was afraid to look at. She said yes. There was one thing that came sooner than any of the formal processes, and it came from the direction she had not fully anticipated. She had been thinking about family, about Darlene and Gary, and the way information traveled in that particular network of cousins and connections. She had been less focused on the neighbors, who were, at the Dressler farm 2 miles up the road, a quiet and generally unremarkable family who kept to themselves and had asked nothing of her beyond the occasional borrowed tool or the teenage son's delivered plate of food. But farms in rural counties are their own ecosystem of observation, and 2 months of regular visitors driving up her gravel road in vehicles that were not farm trucks, carrying professional cases and staying for hours, had not gone entirely unnoticed. The Dressler boy, whose name she had learned was Cal, appeared at her back door on a Thursday afternoon with a dozen eggs from their chickens and an expression that was trying very hard to be casual. He handed her the eggs and said his mother wanted her to have them. Then he looked at the barn and back at her and said, "You've been having a lot of company." She said yes. He said, "Is everything all right?" She said yes. She was working through some things related to the estate. He said, "Right? Sure, just making sure nothing was wrong." She said nothing was wrong. He said, "Well, okay then." He turned to go. Then he stopped and turned back and said, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Calloway, old Mr. Hollis used to walk out to our place sometimes. Just walk over through the field, 2 miles, in the evening sometimes. He and my granddad used to sit on the porch and talk. He said it like it was something he had been carrying around and looking for a place to set down. My granddad said Hollis Calloway was the most careful man he ever met. Said he thought about everything twice before he did it." He nodded once and walked back down the lane, and she stood at the door with the eggs and the echo of the word careful settling around her like something landing. Careful. Hollis had been careful. He had been careful with the chamber and the coins and the documents and the concealment and the property, and she was beginning to understand, careful with the choice of who to leave it to. He had watched her for years, quietly, in the way he watched everything. He had seen something in her that he trusted. And he had left her not just a fortune but the framework for managing it, the cover story of a worthless farm, the low expectation of everyone around her as a kind of armor. He had given her time, by making the inheritance look like a burden. Because everyone who might have looked carefully at what Hollis Calloway left behind had looked at the crumbling farmhouse and the leaning barn and the back taxes and the ruined pasture and decided there was nothing worth looking at carefully. Everyone except her. She brought the eggs inside and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the barn and thought about Hollis walking 2 miles across the field in the evening to sit on a neighbor's porch and talk to an old man who thought he was the most careful person he had ever met. And she said to the window and the barn and whoever might be listening on the other side of things, "I understand now, Hollis. I finally understand what you built." The first person outside of their careful circle who found out was not Darlene. It was not Gary, and it was not anyone from the county assessor's office, and it was not the Dressler boy, who had asked his one careful question and then returned to his side of the fence with what appeared to be a genuine respect for the answer he had not quite received. It was none of the people Ruth had been watching for. It was the roofing company. The roofing company that held the $4,000 lien on the property had been patient, in the way that small businesses with outstanding receivables are patient when they have no better option, which is to say with a patience that had a hard edge of intention behind it. They had sent a notice to the property address in January, which Ruth had received and filed. They sent another in March, which she had also received and was managing as part of the larger financial restructuring Patricia was orchestrating. But in April, 3 months into the formal assessment process, a man from the roofing company drove out to the farm to take a physical look at the property, which was his legal right as a lien holder. And he found a professional bonded transport vehicle in the driveway, and 2 men in clean coveralls carrying catalog containers from the direction of the barn to the vehicle and signing documents on clipboards. And he stood at the end of the driveway and watched this for approximately 4 minutes before he drove back to town. By the following Tuesday, the story had changed shape 3 times before Ruth heard it. The version she heard from Patricia, who had heard it from a contact in the county clerk's office, was that Hollis Calloway's niece had found something valuable in the barn. By the time it reached the diner on Route 9, it had become that she had found a chest of gold coins worth $1 million. By the time it reached Darlene Calloway through the particular network of connections that small counties maintain between people who have known each other for decades, it had become something unspecified but enormous, which was in some ways more destabilizing than a specific number because it left room for the imagination to run in any direction it chose. Darlene called on a Wednesday morning at 7:58, 2 minutes before Ruth needed to get Marcus on the school bus. The call went to voicemail. The voicemail said, "Ruth, I've been hearing some things, and I just want to have a conversation, just family, to make sure everything is being handled correctly. Call me back." The word correctly landed with a particular weight. as if the handling of something was the subject, rather than the thing being handled. Ruth did not call back that day. She texted Patricia instead, who responded within 5 minutes with a message she had apparently been prepared to send for some time. I've drafted a response letter for anyone in the family who makes contact. Do not engage verbally. Direct them to me. Ruth texted back, understood. She put her phone in her pocket and went to get Marcus on the bus. Gary called that evening. He was less careful than Darlene, which Ruth had expected. He said, I just want to know what's going on out there, because I'm hearing things and I think as family we have a right to know what Hollis had, and I want to make sure the will is being followed properly. She said, Gary, everything is being handled by my attorney. He said, your attorney? Since when do you have an attorney? She said, since I inherited a farm. He said, well, I just think family should be kept informed. She said, Patricia Alcorn's contact information is available through Elwood Greer's office, and if you have questions about the estate, she's the right person to answer them. Then she said good night and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and she waited to feel something, some guilt about not telling them, some softening of her position toward people who had looked at her in that parking lot with that expression and had sent her articles about distressed rural properties. She waited for it, and it did not come. What came instead was something quieter and more durable, a sense that she had made every right decision in sequence, slowly, carefully, the way Hollis had apparently made decisions for his entire life, and that she did not owe anyone a shortcut into the results of that carefulness. Patricia sent the letter to both Darlene and Gary the following week. It was 3 paragraphs long. It stated that Ruth Calloway was the sole heir to the Hollis Calloway estate as established by a properly executed and witnessed will, that the estate was currently under legal administration and assessment, and that any communications regarding the estate should be directed to Patricia Alcorn's office. It was courteous, precise, and contained nothing that could be used to argue anything. Ruth read it and thought, that is a beautiful piece of work, and then filed her copy in the folder labeled Correspondence. What followed was what Patricia had described as the middle period, the part of a process like this that had no drama in it, but required the most from you. Because the work was constant and the results were not yet visible, and the pressure from outside was steady, and you had to hold your line without anything concrete to point to. The coin authentication was ongoing. The bond analysis was ongoing. The property title research was ongoing. Every week brought more documentation, more correspondence, more careful, precise language moving back and forth between offices and specialists and institutions. Ruth read all of it. She asked questions when she did not understand, and she understood more each week. She had always been, in her 11 years at the Piggly Wiggly, the person who read the inventory discrepancy reports all the way through when everyone else skimmed them, and that habit was serving her now. She also worked the farm. This was the thing nobody expected, including, she suspected, Patricia, who had told her to maintain the surface of her life unchanged and had meant it tactically, but had not anticipated that Ruth would take it literally and comprehensively. She applied for an agricultural rehabilitation grant through the county extension office, the same grant she had researched in the library in February, and she spent her mornings and several of her evenings working through the application with a thoroughness that impressed the extension agent enough that she called twice to ask follow-up questions. She had the soil tested in the South Fields, which confirmed what she had suspected, that with amendment and proper management those fields could support a cash crop within 2 seasons. She contacted a beekeeping supply company about re-establishing hives, because the land had been hive land before and the old equipment was still in the farmhouse outbuildings, and Hollis had known something about bees that she intended to learn. She repaired the farmhouse roof section by section, hiring 2 men from town who worked in the way she respected, without drama, one problem at a time. She painted the south-facing walls of the house that had been stripped to bare wood. She reinforced the porch. She began, slowly, to make the farm look like the beginning of something rather than the end. Marcus, who had inherited from someone, perhaps from her, perhaps from the air of the place itself, a capacity for useful physical work, spent his weekends building a proper garden fence from salvaged lumber and helping her clear the old blackberry cane from the south edge of the yard. Lily planted things in the garden that she had read about in a library book on Kentucky heritage vegetables, things with names like turkey craw beans and mortgage lifter tomatoes, a name that made Ruth laugh out loud when she read it on the seed packet, a real, full laugh that she had not produced in some time. Lily wrote about the garden. She wrote about the fence Marcus built. She wrote about the way the farm looked different now, not fixed, not finished, but pointed in a direction. The authentication of the gold coins was completed in late May. Philip Greer delivered the final report in person, as he had delivered everything in person, and sat at the kitchen table with his careful hands and his worn notebook and read the conclusions in the same measured voice he had used for the preliminary figures. The total authenticated value of the gold coin collection, based on professional grading results from an independent numismatic grading service and current market conditions, was $11,430,000. The silver collection, fully counted and graded, came to $892,000. He said the numbers slowly and clearly and watched Ruth's face while he said them. She had had weeks to prepare for a number in this range. She had known, intellectually, what the range was, had been living with that knowledge through the middle period, carrying it through grant applications and garden planting and roof repair. But there is a difference between knowing a range and hearing a specific number, and the specific number sat in the kitchen air between them and had a weight and a shape that the range had never had. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She said, "Philip, I want you to know that I understand the value of what you've done here, and I intend to compensate you appropriately." He said, "Patricia has already outlined the fee arrangement, and it is very fair, and I am not concerned." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I think so." He said, "Take your time." She took her time. Then she said, $12.3 million. He said, "Approximately, yes." She said, "From a farm that everyone agreed was worthless." He said, "The farm was never worthless. It just looked that way." He closed his notebook. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I hope it is not overstepping. I have been doing this work for 35 years. I have seen collections in bank vaults and estate houses and university archives and museum storage. This collection, in terms of completeness and condition and the deliberateness of its assembly, is among the finest I have encountered. Whoever built it was not simply hoarding. They were building something with intention. They were thinking about the future." He paused. "You were the future they were thinking about." She could not speak for a moment. He stood and picked up his case and said, "Patricia will be in touch about next steps. And Ruth," he said at the door, "spend it well." She said, "I intend to." The bond redemption process, which Patricia had warned her could take anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, took 4 months and 2 weeks and required correspondence with 3 separate financial institutions, one of which initially denied the validity of the instruments before a specialist in historical securities law produced documentation that changed their position over the course of 6 weeks of careful, unemotional argument. The 4 valid bonds, when redeemed, totaled $2,640,000, which was higher than the face value estimate because of the accrued interest calculation Patricia's team had pushed to have properly applied. Patricia sent Ruth the final confirmation on a Thursday afternoon. Ruth was in the south field, checking on the soil amendment she had applied 6 weeks earlier, when the notification came through on her phone. She stood in the field with her boots in the amended soil and read the number and looked at the sky, which was the particular shade of early summer blue that Kentucky produces when it is at its best, and she said, "All right then," very quietly, to nobody in particular and to the most particular person of all. The property claims took longer. The title research on the 22 relevant parcels produced results that ranged across a spectrum Patricia had outlined at the beginning. 8 of the 22, on examination, had title chains that were complex but defensible on the other side, meaning that subsequent owners had legal standing that would be difficult and expensive to challenge, and Patricia's recommendation was to document the original instruments but not pursue active claims. 7 more were in a middle territory that would require negotiation rather than litigation, and Patricia's approach was to send formal notice of the historical interest and enter into quiet discussions with the current holders that might result in settlement rather than courtroom conflict. And 7 of the 22, the strongest instruments, relating to parcels in 2 adjacent counties where the Depression-era transactions had been irregular in documented and provable ways, were the basis of formal claims that Patricia filed in the appropriate courts in late summer. It was the formal filings that finally made the story impossible to contain. Legal filings are public records. A legal filing asserting property claims connected to the Calloway estate, even framed in the careful professional language Patricia used, was a document that existed in the world and could be found by anyone who was paying attention and knew where to look. The county newspaper found it first, and the story they ran was brief and factual, saying only that the estate of Hollis Calloway of the Calloway farm was asserting historical land claims in connection with the estate and that the matter was before the courts. But the regional paper picked it up the following week, and the reporter who covered it was more enterprising and had heard from one of the contacts that reporters in small regional markets maintain the way spider plants maintain roots, something about coins and a barn and an assessment team that had been coming and going from the farm over the spring. The story he ran was longer and less careful, and it had the word fortune in the headline, and that was the word that changed everything. Ruth had known it was coming. Patricia had told her to expect it and had prepared her for it, had coached her on what to say and what not to say and how to stand when a camera was pointed at her, which was the same way she stood when she was not being filmed, upright and steady and without apology. The local television station called, and she directed them to Patricia. The regional station called, and she directed them to Patricia. 2 true crime podcast producers called within the same week, and she did not direct them anywhere. She simply said no thank you and ended the calls. The family was a different conversation. Darlene came to the farm in person, which Ruth had expected. She came on a Saturday morning when she knew from some network of information that Ruth would be home, and she sat across from Ruth at the kitchen table in the farmhouse that Ruth had painted and repaired and made livable, and she looked around the kitchen with an expression that was working through several feelings at once. She said, "I heard the figure." Ruth said, "Which figure?" Darlene said, "The one in the paper." Ruth said, "The paper only had part of it." Darlene was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You really didn't know." Ruth said, "I knew something was there. I didn't know what until I looked carefully." Darlene looked at the cast iron stove and the repaired window and the ceiling Ruth had patched. She said, "I told you in the parking lot." Ruth said, "You did." Darlene said, "I thought I was helping you." Ruth said, "I know." Darlene said, "If I had known." She left it unfinished again. Ruth looked at her cousin. She said, "Darlene, the will was clear. Everything Hollis had was left to me. I know that's difficult. I know it doesn't feel right from where you're sitting. But I need you to understand that I am not going to apologize for it. I didn't take anything from anyone. Hollis made a choice, and I am going to honor it." Darlene looked at the table. She said, "I don't want you to apologize. I just—" She stopped. Ruth waited. Darlene said, "I just want to know why. Why you and not us? Why not any of us who shared his blood as close as you do?" Ruth said, "I went to see him 4 times. I brought my children." Lily wrote down the names of the birds he told her about. He watched her write them down. She paused. "I think that's why." Darlene looked out the window at the barn. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He was lonely." Ruth said, "Yes. He was very lonely." Darlene said, "None of us went to see him." Ruth said, "No." There was nothing accusatory in how she said it. It was simply true, and Darlene heard it as what it was. She sat with it for several seconds, and then something changed in her face, not dramatically, but the way a knot in a rope will shift when the tension on it is released. She said, "The silverware." Ruth said, "Yes." Darlene said, "He polished it himself." She said it like it had just occurred to her. "He sent someone to give me the silverware, and it was polished." She looked at her hands. "We barely spoke to him." She stood up and straightened her coat. She said, "Congratulations, Ruth. I mean that." Ruth said, "Thank you, Darlene." After Darlene left, Ruth stood at the kitchen window for a long time. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated in the way that people imagine vindication must feel, dramatic and warm and complete. What she felt was something closer to tired and quiet and very clear. Darlene had been wrong in the parking lot, and Gary had been wrong in every assumption he had ever made about this property and what it was worth and what Ruth deserved to receive. The county had been wrong. The neighbors had been wrong. Everyone who had said the Calloway place as a punchline had been wrong. But being right about the thing and feeling something rich and clean about being right turned out to be separate questions. The wealth was real. The relief was real. But the vindication she had imagined during those February nights at the kitchen table with the $412 in the bank account turned out to feel less like triumph and more like clarity. She had not needed the world to be wrong in order to be right. She had only needed to keep going. And she had kept going. And here was what that had produced. That was enough. It was more than enough. Gary did not come in person. He sent a letter through a lawyer, which Patricia received and read and dispatched with a response that was 3 sentences long and which Gary apparently found sufficiently clear because there was no second letter. Ruth never knew the exact content of either letter and did not ask. It was resolved, and that was enough. The news that the property claims had resulted in settlements on 4 of the 7 contested parcels came on a gray October afternoon when Ruth was putting the garden to bed for the winter, covering the bean rows with straw and pulling the spent tomato vines from their stakes. Patricia called and said, "We have agreements on 4. She named the acreage. Combined, the 4 settled parcels added 217 acres to the farm, bringing the total to just over 620 acres, and the assessed value of the additional land, once transferred, added somewhere between $3 and $4 million to the estate value. The 3 remaining contested parcels were still in process and might be for some time, and the outcome was less certain. Ruth said, 217 acres is enough for now. Patricia said, yes. Then she said, I want you to know something. I've been practicing law for 23 years. This is not the largest estate I have managed, but it is the most carefully architected one I have ever seen. Hollis Calloway was a remarkable person. Ruth said he was. He really was. She paid the back taxes the next morning. $14,632, settled in full through Patricia's escrow account, with the documentation structured properly so that the payment appeared as a routine estate settlement rather than a sudden influx of money. She paid the roofing lien on the same day, for $1,200, to the company that had held its claim with grim patience for months and whose man in the driveway watching the catalog containers had set the whole visible sequence in motion. She thanked them, in the letter Patricia drafted, for their patience. She meant it. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She sat at the kitchen table alone. In the farmhouse she had repaired room by room with her own hands through a Kentucky winter, and she let herself think about what was possible. Not what was certain, not what was secured, but what was possible. She had never in her adult life had the luxury of thinking about the possible without immediately colliding with the wall of what was not affordable. The sensation was strange and enormous, and she let herself sit in it for a long time before she did anything else. Marcus's college fund was established that month, through a mechanism Patricia's financial advisor recommended, structured and protected, sufficient at the current figure to put him through any school he chose and the graduate program that followed it if he wanted one. Ruth told him on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting across from him at the kitchen table that had been in the farmhouse when she arrived and that she had decided to keep because it was exactly right. She told him the structure and the amount, and she watched his face, which was now the face of a boy who was 3 months from turning 14 and who had spent the past year becoming someone she was increasingly certain was going to be remarkable in ways she could not yet fully see. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, Mom. She said yes. He said, Dad. She said yes. He said, it was always going to be okay. She said, I wasn't sure about that for a while. He said, I know. I was. She looked at him and thought, where did you come from? And then thought, I know exactly where you came from. Lily's response to the education news was different. Lily had always understood money in her bones the way children who have grown up watching their parents manage without it often do, not as an abstract, but as a concrete reality whose presence or absence determined the texture of daily life. When Ruth sat her down and explained, in terms she thought Lily could hold, that they were going to be all right now, that they were more than all right, that her education and her future and the years between now and whatever she became were going to have the resources they needed behind them. Lily was quiet for a moment and then said, Can I have a better notebook? Ruth laughed, a real full one. She said, You can have as many notebooks as you want for the rest of your life. Lily said, Just one good one is fine. She thought about it. And maybe a library. She said it the way you say something you don't quite expect to be taken seriously. Ruth said, Tell me what kind. Lily described what she meant, which was a room in the farmhouse, the room at the back that currently held the old farming equipment she hadn't known what to do with, a room with good light and shelves along every wall and a desk near the window that looked out toward the elm tree where the crow still came every morning. Ruth listened to every word of it and said, I think we can do that. Lily looked at her with the particular expression of a 9-year-old who suspects she has gotten something that was more than she asked for. She opened her notebook and wrote something. Ruth did not ask what. She had learned, over the course of this year, that Lily's notebook would eventually give up its contents in its own time and in its own way, and that the best thing to do with that was to trust it. The decision about the house took longer. Ruth had thought, in the earliest days of the estate process, that she would eventually move, that the farmhouse was a way station, a temporary necessity, the container for the season of difficult work before the real chapter began somewhere with better schools and a shorter drive to a city and a house that hadn't required her personal labor to be livable. She had thought this without examining it carefully, the way you think things you have not decided but have assumed. And then somewhere in the middle of the spring, between the soil testing and the roof repair and the first serious conversations with Patricia about the full scope of what she had stopped thinking it. She had not made a different decision. She had simply noticed that the assumption had quietly changed itself. The farm was not a way station. It was the thing itself. It was 620 acres of Kentucky land that had been held by a family for more than 100 years, and that was, she had come to understand through a long season of walking it, genuinely remarkable land. The creek was clean and ran year-round. The old-growth timber on the eastern edge had not been logged in decades and was mature and various and full. The south fields, with proper management, would produce. The soil near the creek was some of the richest she had found anywhere on the property. The farm had been run down and neglected, but it had not been ruined, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered. Hollis had understood it. She was beginning to understand it too. She hired a farm manager. He was a man in his 50s named Wendell Price who had grown up farming in the next county and had spent the last decade managing properties for people who owned land they did not have time to tend themselves. And he came to the Calloway farm in late summer and walked every acre of it with Ruth and said, at the end of the walk, that it was better land than it looked and that the previous owner had kept the soil from getting worse than it was, which was not nothing. He said he could have the south fields producing small grain within 2 seasons and have a hay operation running in the 3rd year that could support a small cattle herd on the north pasture within 5 years. Ruth said, "Draw me a plan." He drew her a plan. She read every page of it. She also hired a contractor for the house, not to replace it but to restore it, which was different and more expensive in the short term and far more correct in the way that mattered to her. The contractor was a woman who specialized in historic farmhouse restoration and who walked through the house on her first visit making notes with the focused attention of someone who was reading a text she could not put down. She said the bones of the house were exceptional. She said whoever had built it in 1921 had known what they were doing and had used materials of a quality that were not commonly found in domestic construction of that period. She said the farmhouse could be made into something that people would drive past and look at, which was not the same as gawking at spectacle, but the particular regard one gave to something that was beautiful in an honest way. Ruth said, "That's what I want." The restoration took most of a year. Marcus and Lily continued in the county school through the process because Ruth had thought about it and concluded that continuity mattered more than convenience, that her children had put down roots in this community and that roots, once established, were worth something. Marcus had made 2 friends he ate lunch with every day. Lily had found a teacher who understood her and had loaned her 3 books from her own shelves. These were not small things. The day Wendell Price told her the first hay cutting was coming in from the south fields, and she stood at the edge of the field and watched the equipment move through the rows and smelled the cut grass in the summer air, she thought about the extension agent who had come to the farm in February with her carefully neutral face. Ruth had seen that woman at the county fair in July, and the woman had looked at her with an expression that was trying to find the right combination of professional warmth and genuine surprise, and Ruth had simply smiled and said it was a good fair this year and moved on. She did not need the expression to resolve itself. She did not need the validation that the expression was trying and failing to perform. She had the cut hay and the 620 acres and the restored farmhouse and Lily's library and Marcus's college fund, and the knowledge that she had done every step of this correctly and carefully, the way Hollis would have done it. On a Saturday in September, exactly 19 months after she had driven down the gravel road with her children and the rented trailer and the cleaning supplies, Ruth walked to the barn. The barn had been stabilized structurally, the collapsed section shored up, and the fallen roof secured against further movement. It was not restored. It might never be fully restored. But it was no longer dangerous, and it was no longer hiding anything. The chamber below had been properly documented and emptied under full legal supervision. its contents moved to proper storage, and from there to the sale and redemption processes that had been yielding results all year. The chamber itself was now simply a room beneath a barn, a very old room built by very careful hands, lit now by the single work light she had set up there months ago and left running on a timer. She went down the stairs, which she had repaired when the chamber was being worked, and stood in the stone room for what she understood might be the last time she came here alone. The shelves were empty. The floor was clean. The air still held its particular underground quality, mineral and cool and very still. She stood in the center of the room and turned slowly the way she had turned the first time, and the way Philip Greer had turned, and the way Earl Combs had turned, each of them trying to take in the full scope of something that was larger than a single angle of vision could contain. She thought about Hollis's father, who she now knew from the historical research had built this chamber in 1932, the worst year of the Depression, when the banks were failing and the farm was producing barely enough, and the family had two choices, which were to lose what they had to a system they did not trust or to put it in the ground and trust the ground. She thought about 3 generations of Calloway men who had known this room was here and had kept it, maintained it, paid the taxes on the property through decades when selling would have been the sensible answer because you did not give up the thing you were holding for someone who had not yet arrived. The professor from the University of Kentucky, in the course of his research into the property documents, had assembled a picture of the Calloway family history that he had shared with Ruth in a long, careful conversation over the phone in early summer. The Calloways had come to Kentucky in the 1880s, farming people, not wealthy but steady, the kind of family that built things to last and maintained what they built. Hollis's grandfather had been the one who began the coin collection, systematically converting the farm's surplus through the 1920s into gold and silver because he had survived one bank panic and did not intend to survive another. He had also, through the Depression years, been approached by neighbors who were losing their land to tax sale and to predatory buyers who offered pennies on the dollar and who had, in some cases, arranged the conditions that made the sale necessary. He had purchased some of those parcels at fair prices when he could afford it and accepted deeds as partial payment for help he extended when he could not. And he had kept every document with the same care he kept every coin, because he understood that a piece of paper that described land was itself a form of wealth, if you were patient enough to wait for the circumstances where it could be used. Hollis's father had continued what the grandfather began, and Hollis himself had lived the whole of his adult life as the keeper of a thing he had not created but had been trusted with, and had done the job with such consistent and unspectacular fidelity that no one in the county had ever thought to look at the Calloway place and see anything other than an old man and a failing farm. Until now, Ruth thought about what it meant to hold something for 60 years on behalf of someone who had not arrived yet. She thought about the loneliness of that, the sustained, daily, unrewarded discipline of it. She had held things herself, had held the possibility of a better situation for her children through 11 years of checkout lines and tight budgets and decisions made at the margin, and she knew something about what that kind of holding required. But 60 years was another order of magnitude entirely. 60 years of maintaining the cover of the worthless farm, of paying the taxes, and repairing what needed repairing just enough to keep the chamber viable, and letting the rest decline just enough to keep people from looking too closely. 60 years of being the most careful man anyone knew, and naming birds from a porch, and waiting. She thought about that, and she thought, Hollis, you were the bravest person I've ever encountered in my life. And no one ever knew. She thought about Hollis at 81 years old, sitting on the porch naming birds, watching a 9-year-old girl write the names in a notebook, and understanding that the person had arrived. She said, I know why you chose me, Hollis. It wasn't only the visits. She paused. It was because I was the only one who came and didn't need anything from you. The others didn't come at all. But if they had come, they would have wanted something. She looked at the empty shelves. I just wanted to sit on the porch. She stopped. Thank you for seeing that. She turned off the work light and went back up the stairs for the last time and closed the hatch above her and stood in the barn in the September afternoon light that came through the repaired gaps in the roof and was the particular slanted gold of Kentucky September, and she breathed. Outside, she could hear Marcus splitting wood for the winter store, the clean, regular sound of the maul finding the grain. She could hear Lily somewhere near the house, probably in the garden, talking to the crow, which had become such a fixed part of the yard's daily life that she had named it in her most recent notebook entry with an appropriate formality. The farm was alive with its own new rhythm, and she stood in the old barn and listened to it. She walked back to the house. Wendell's truck was at the gate, which meant he had stopped in on his way home from the south fields. She could hear him talking to Marcus in the yard about the hay yield figures, which Marcus had apparently been waiting to ask about, because he had that focused listening posture he got when someone was telling him something he intended to retain. She walked back to the house. Wendell's truck was at the gate, which meant he had stopped in on his way home from the south fields. She could hear him talking to Marcus in the yard about the hay yield figures, which Marcus had apparently been waiting to ask about, because he had that focused listening posture he got when someone was telling him something he intended to retain. The community had shifted around her slowly, the way communities shift when something upends their shared understanding of a person or a place. The county newspaper had run a second story after the first, a longer one, and this time the reporter had called Ruth, and she had given him 15 minutes on the phone, not about the financial details, which she directed to Patricia, but about the farm and what she intended to do with it. She said she was going to farm it. She said she was going to restore it properly and farm it and raise her children on it. The reporter had sounded faintly surprised, as if he had expected a different answer, an answer involving leaving or investing or converting the land to something other than what it was. She said, "This land has been in one family for more than 100 years. I don't think it needs to become something else. It needs to become what it was always meant to be." That sentence ran in the paper, and she heard from 4 different people over the following week that they had read it, including the extension agent with the carefully neutral face, who stopped her at the gas station and said, "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing." And Ruth said thank you and meant it without irony, which was its own kind of grace. The feed supply store, where she had heard people say the Calloway place in that particular tone in her first weeks at the farm, had changed its register with her. Not dramatically, not with apology or acknowledgement, but in the small, quiet ways that indicated a recalibration. The man behind the counter asked about the hay operation with a genuine interest he had not previously shown. The woman who ran the small grocery gave her a recommendation for a farrier when she mentioned she was considering horses for the north pasture, and the recommendation was offered freely and warmly, as if they had always been the kind of neighbors who exchanged useful information. Ruth accepted all of it without comment, without pointing to the distance between this and the way things had been in February. She did not need them to acknowledge the distance. She knew the distance. That was sufficient. The one conversation she had not expected came from the county commissioner, a man named Halbert who had been in office for 12 years and who called her office, which was now Patricia's office acting on her behalf, and requested a meeting. Ruth went to the meeting with Patricia and sat across from him in the county building conference room and listened to him say that the county was proud to have a family enterprise of this significance in the agricultural base, and that there were grant programs and tax incentives available for historic farm restoration and agricultural development that he wanted to make sure she was aware of. She listened to the full presentation. She took the materials. She thanked him. In the car afterward, Patricia said, "That's the same county commissioner who set the tax sale timeline that was going to force you to sell within 18 months if you hadn't resolved the back taxes." Ruth said, "I know." Patricia said, "You're not angry?" Ruth said, "I'm aware. There's a difference." She put the materials in her folder. Some of them were actually useful. Lily was in the garden, not talking to the crow as it turned out, but sitting on the garden wall with her notebook and a pencil, and the crow observing her from the elm branch with what she had always claimed was intellectual curiosity and what Ruth now found she could no longer dismiss. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked at her children and her farm manager and her house with its new roof and its fresh paint and its windows that no longer had duct tape holding them together, and she let herself feel the full weight of it, which was not triumphant exactly, not the dramatic vindication of a story with a clean moral, but something slower and steadier and more durable. She had not been proven right. She had not beaten anyone. She had simply not stopped, had not looked at the worthless farm and believed the consensus, had not accepted that the only things worth having were the things that looked valuable from a distance. She had looked closely. She had been patient. She had been careful, in the way that Cal Dressler's grandfather had said Hollis was careful, the most careful man he knew. She had learned that from Hollis. She had learned it from the example he set without ever explaining it, from the chamber he built without ever revealing it, from the life he lived without ever advertising it. She had learned that the most valuable things were often the things that had been made to look like they weren't worth anything, and that patience was not a passive quality, but an active one, a daily discipline, a choice made over and over again to keep going when the surface of the situation gave you every reason to stop. Lily looked up from her notebook and saw her mother standing at the edge of the yard and raised her hand in a wave that was also a summons, the particular gesture that meant, "Come see what I'm writing. I think you'll want to see it." Ruth walked across the yard toward her daughter, and the crow watched them both from the elm tree with its bright, intelligent eye, and the September light came down through the canopy of the old farm in long, warm bars, and the sound of Marcus splitting wood kept its clean, regular time, and the south fields lay cut and settled and ready for next season. She sat beside Lily on the garden wall and looked at the notebook. Lily had written, in her careful hand, a description of the farm as it looked right now in this particular September afternoon light, the house and the barn and the tree and the fields and the sky. And at the bottom of the page, she had written one sentence that stood apart from the description, separated by a line of white space, the way you separate a conclusion from the evidence that produced it. The sentence said, "Some things look worthless until someone looks at them the way they deserve to be looked at." Ruth read it twice. She put her arm around Lily's shoulders. She said, "That's." To the county's historical archive in her tenure, watched Lily work from across the room with an expression Ruth recognized. It was the same expression Hollis had worn on the porch, the recognition of something worth paying attention to. Before they left, Marjorie handed Ruth a small envelope. She said, "We found this tucked into the back of the ledger books you donated to the archive. We thought you should have it." Ruth opened it in the car, under the dome light, with Marcus and Lily watching. Inside was a note in Hollis's handwriting, the same tight left-angled script from the birthday cards. It said only this: "The land remembers who worked it honestly. Make sure it remembers you." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and drove home without speaking. And the children understood without being told that this was one of those moments that did not require words around it. The note stayed in her coat pocket for the rest of that winter, moving from pocket to pocket as the coats changed with the weather, until she finally placed it in a small frame and set it on the windowsill above the cast-iron sink in the farmhouse kitchen, where the morning light reached it first. The final 3 property claims resolved across the following 2 years, one by negotiated settlement, one by court decision in Ruth's favor, and one, the most complex, by a quiet agreement with a land trust that had acquired the parcel decades earlier and whose legal counsel, upon reviewing Patricia's documentation, had concluded that the original transaction was irregular enough to warrant resolution rather than litigation. The combined additional acreage from the 3 final settlements brought the Calloway farm to just over 800 acres. Ruth did not celebrate the number. She walked the new parcels with Wendell and assessed what each one needed and added them to the management plan the same way she added every other task, methodically, without drama, one season at a time. Marcus left for university on a morning in late August, his second year after the story broke, driving himself in a truck that had been Ruth's graduation present to him, and that he had spent the summer learning to maintain properly, because he had decided, with the particular thoroughness that characterized everything he did, that if he was going to own a vehicle, he was going to understand it. He called her from the road when he was 2 hours out, not because he was homesick, but because he had seen a red-tailed hawk on a fence post and had thought of the porch and the birds and Hollis, and he wanted to tell someone. She stood at the kitchen window with the phone to her ear and listened to him describe the hawk, its posture, the way it held its head, and she thought, "Hollis would have liked you so much." She did not say it, but she thought it, and that was enough. The crow was still there. It had been there every morning for 4 years now, and Lily had accumulated in her notebooks a record of its behavior that had grown detailed enough that the biology teacher at the county high school had asked if she would be willing to share it with the class, which Lily had agreed to with the composure of someone who had known for some time that her observations were worth sharing. She was 13 now, and the notebooks had multiplied to fill 2 shelves of the library that Ruth had built in the back room with the good light and the window overlooking the elm tree, and the writing in them had become something that Ruth could see, even without the vocabulary to describe it precisely, was becoming real, becoming the thing it had been pointed at all along. One morning in early spring, Lily came to breakfast and set a printed page on the table beside Ruth's coffee cup, and sat down and poured her cereal and said nothing. Ruth picked up the page. It was an acceptance letter from a regional literary journal addressed to Lily Calloway, thanking her for her submission and informing her that her essay on observational practice and patience, titled Simply What the Crow Knows, had been selected for publication in the spring issue. Ruth set the page down very carefully. She looked at her daughter. Lily was eating her cereal. She said, without looking up, "I dedicated it to Hollis." Ruth said, "That's exactly right." Lily said, "I know." Outside, in the elm tree, the crow sat in the early light and watched the farmhouse the way it watched everything, with the attentive, undemonstrative intelligence of a creature that had learned, over 4 years of mornings, that this particular place was worth watching carefully. The farm spread out behind it, 800 acres of worked and tended and slowly restored land, doing what land does when people commit to it honestly. Growing, holding, remembering. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. Exactly right. Lily said, "I know." The crow shifted on its branch. The wood splitting continued in its steady rhythm. The farm held its ground around them, as it had always held its ground, as it would hold its ground long after this particular September afternoon had become something that people told their children about. The story of the worthless farm and the woman who looked at it closely and found everything that everyone else had agreed wasn't there. She looked at the barn one more time from across the yard, standing there in its repaired and stabilized and honest state, no longer hiding anything, no longer needing to. And she thought about what it meant to receive something that had been kept for you, something that required your specific kind of patience and your specific kind of seeing to unlock. She thought about what it meant to be the person someone had been waiting for, without knowing it, without being told, but knowing it anyway in the particular way that Lily knew things and wrote them down. She thought, "I was always going to find it, because I was always going to look." And she opened her hand and held it in the September light for a moment. That thought, that knowledge, that enormous quiet thing. And then she let it go, because she did not need to hold it anymore. It was already in the farm and in the children and in the notebooks and in the hay cut and laid in the south fields and in the stone room under the old barn floor, quiet now and empty and no longer secret. It was in the seeds Lily had planted that were already thinking about spring. It was in Marcus's future, already forming itself in the direction of something large and worthy of him. It was in the crow, who watched all of this from its elm branch with its bright and unremarkable eye, and who would be back tomorrow, as it was always back, because this was its place now, and it knew a good place when it found one. And perhaps most of all it was in Ruth herself, who had become in the space of 19 months something she could not have described in February from that kitchen table with the $412 and the crack in the taillight and the furnace that needed coaxing. She had become someone who knew what she was worth, not in the financial sense, though she understood that now too, but in the older and more important sense, the sense that had nothing to do with what other people decided to see when they looked at her. She had always been someone who looked closely at things. Hollis had seen that. He had waited for someone who would look closely at what he had built and understand it, and not be frightened by its scale, or its complexity, or the patience it required to manage. He had waited, and she had come, and she had looked, and she had understood, and she had not been frightened. She did not know everything yet. She did not know how the 3 remaining property claims would resolve. She did not know exactly what the farm would look like in 10 years or 20, what Wendell would build it into, what Marcus and Lily would choose to do with their portions of a legacy that was now theirs as much as hers. She did not know what Lily would write in the years ahead, though she suspected it would be remarkable, or what Marcus would study and become, though she was certain it would be worthy of him. She did not know any of those things, but she knew the ground beneath her feet, and she knew the stone room below the old barn, and she knew the quality of her children's characters, and she knew that Hollis Calloway had been right about all of it, and that, in the September light, on the farm that had looked worthless until someone looked at it the way it deserved to be looked at, was more than enough to go on with. 3 years after the September afternoon, when Lily wrote her sentence about looking at things the way they deserved to be looked at, the County Historical Society mounted a small exhibition in the town library about the Calloway farm. Ruth attended with both children on a Thursday evening in October. The exhibition occupied 2 rooms. In the first, behind glass, were photographs of the farm spanning a century, sourced from the county archives and from a box of old prints Patricia's team had found among Hollis's personal papers in the farmhouse. In the second room, mounted on clean white boards, were documents. Not the originals, which were in proper archival storage, but high-resolution reproductions, each one annotated in careful descriptive text that the Historical Society's director had written in consultation with the professor from the University of Kentucky. Marcus stood in front of the photograph of the farm taken in 1938, when the barn was at its peak, when the fields were full and the farmhouse had its original front porch intact, and 3 men whose names were identified in pencil on the back of the print stood at the gate looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of people who are proud of what stands behind them. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "That's what it's going to look like again." He said it not as a question and not as hope, but as the statement of a person who has measured the distance between where something is and where it's going and found the distance manageable. Ruth stood beside him and looked at the photograph and said, "Yes. That's exactly what it's going to look like." Lily did not spend much time with the photographs. She spent most of the evening in the document room, reading every annotation twice, her notebook open, her pen moving. The Historical Society director, a woman in her 60s named Marjorie who had devoted 30 years to the preservation of county records and who had told Ruth privately that the Calloway materials were the most significant addition,